Welcome to the Politics of Everything. I'm Amber Daines, your host and podcast producer. This is a half hour of power, a podcast dropping every week where I unpack the politics of everything, from money to motherhood, nutrition to narcissism, startups to secularism, the environment, quality, and much, much more. Our guests are seasoned in the field or topic of their choice, even if you've not heard of them yet. This is a non-partisan show. So while I love exploring varied views and get a buzz from a healthy debate of ideas, this is not a purely blue, white, green program. Please subscribe, tune in and enjoy the politics of everything. My guest today is a podcast Hall of Fame winner, so this should keep me on my toes. Dr. Ginger Campbell is also a physician, author, and science communicator. She is the author of Are You Sure? The Unconscious Origins of Certainty, and she is a member of the Podcast Hall of Fame 2022. Dr. Campbell began podcasting in 2006 when she launched her two shows, Brain Science and Books and Ideas. Both feature interviews with scientists, but Books and Ideas includes more diverse guests, including science fiction writers. And in 2018, she launched Graving Rainbows, which took her interview skills to a more personal level. Brain Science is still going strong and is widely regarded as the best podcast about neuroscience. And I have to admit, I've listened to a few episodes and it's fabulous. She's spent over 20 years as an emergency physician in rural Alabama. In 2014, she went back to the University of Alabama in Birmingham, where she completed a fellowship in palliative medicine. She now practices palliative medicine at the Veterans Administrative Medical Center in Birmingham, Alabama, where she enjoys both patient care and teaching residents, fellows, and medical students. Ginger enjoys sharing her passion for science and especially neuroscience, and her goal is to make these topics accessible to people from all backgrounds. So a warm welcome to you, Ginger, on the Politics of Everything.
Thanks, Amber. I'm so happy to be here.
Podcasting remotely can be challenging, but it doesn't have to be. Since day one of the Politics of Everything, I have relied on Zencastr's all-in-one solution to make the process quick and painless, the way it should be for those of us who just love great content and want to get our ideas out into the world. If you know me, I'm obsessed with quality in terms of my guests, my sound, and everything about my show has to be great the first time. I'm time poor. It's so easy to use Zencastr. I'm not tech savvy and you don't need to be either. There's nothing to download. Just click on the link and off we go. Zencastr is all about making your podcasting experience easy, and with everything from local recording to automatic post-productions now in their toolkit, you don't have to leave your browser to get that episode done, and done fast. I have a special offer for you, and hopefully you can experience what I have with Zencastr. Go to zencastr.com/pricing and use my VIP code, the Politics of Everything, all lowercase and one word, to get 30% off your first 3 months of Zencastr Professional. How good is that? I want you to have the same easy experiences I do for all my podcasting and content needs. It's time to share your story. I love your accent. It's so awesome. And my accent's probably a little bit novel to you too. So I love having diverse guests. But I'm going to ask you a question I ask all my guests. As a kid, did you have an idea of what you wanted to do as an adult when you grew up? Did you always want to be in the medical world?
I was going to be...
No. Were you going to be like something else? I don't know.
I was going to be the first woman in the NFL. That's the National Football League.
Wow. So you're a sporty kid.
Yeah, until puberty, and then I realized that wasn't a realistic career goal. I grew up in Huntsville, Alabama, which was very important in the Apollo program, putting man on the moon. So it seemed natural to go into engineering. I didn't really get interested in medicine until the last year of college. And so I have spent most of my career, taking care of people, doing medicine, but keeping a passion for other areas of science.
Excellent. I love that. And I guess you were smart enough to study medicine. It's all very well to want to do it, but it's not, it's a highly competitive course to get into, I imagine. So obviously you had the aptitude for that. On to our topic today. Look, the concept of science is familiar to many of us, and obviously you specialise in neuroscience, which I mentioned in the introduction. Can you explain quickly for those of us who might be less familiar with that concept, what it involves and why you like it so much?
Okay, so the first thing I got to say is I'm not a neuroscientist. One of my friends in podcasting, Jessica Kupferman, always calls me a neurosurgeon. I I actually started in engineering and, became an ER physician. But I got interested in neuroscience about 20 years ago. It was just what I happened to be reading, really, when podcasting came along and went down that. But the reason that I love neuroscience is that it's about what makes us human. I mean, like if you studied quantum mechanics, you don't really, I mean, it's fascinating. I just read a really good book about it a few days ago, but it's hard to figure out how it relates to your day-to-day life, but understanding how your brain works relates to why we act the way we do and why other people act the way that they do. So I think neuroscience is a great way to get people interested in science in general because it's about, what makes us us.
Yeah, I love it. And I think that's the thing. You're fascinated about the human side of it as well. So, how does sort of neuroscience in your experience relate to our everyday life? I mean, how we communicate might be one thing, how we operate in a work environment and in our relationships. There are a couple of examples perhaps that kind of showcase what neuroscience looks like in action.
Well, the most obvious one that I usually go to when someone asks me is understanding how memory works because it doesn't work the way people think it does. It's not like a tape recorder where you like have an exact recording of what happened and I have an exact recording of what happened. That's actually not what happens at all. It turns out that every time we remember something, our brain recreates the memory from scratch.
That's
And
wild
this
when you think about that, isn't
it
it? Because
is, and
in
that's
our
why
heads, even as you're saying it, I'm like, but I'm sure I remember it exactly as it happened. Like you say, like watching a movie, you know what I mean? Where you've pressed record and you play it back, but you're saying that's not the case.
right, and it makes sense if you think about the fact that memory is for survival, and so what we need is not an exact memory, what we need is a way to incorporate new knowledge, and so that's what we do. Our brain stuffs new stuff in between, and we can't tell the difference. Do you have brothers and sisters?
I don't. I'm an only child. I have
Okay,
step
well, for
siblings, but I
those
don't
listeners who
don't
have
have. Yeah.
Yeah, but if you have someone you grew up with and you ever have a conversation with your childhood about your childhood, you discover that you remember things. I have a sister that's only a year younger than me, and it's amazing how different our memories are. Sometimes it's like we weren't even in the same, even when we remember a same event, like her memory of my breaking my arm and my memory of my breaking my arm, not the same memory. So people got into these lifelong feuds about stuff like this, right? And if they just understood that, no, our memories are, you know, very fragile, relatively unreliable things, we wouldn't be throwing, telling say, hey, you got dementia because you told to change the story or whatever. We could be, and memoir people who write memoirs have sort of clued into this. They've started writing, yeah, I know that my memory of this is not perfect, but this is how I remember it. But it could have a lot of help people get along better if they understood how memory really works. So that's kind of my favorite example.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think that makes sense, even though it's a little bit surprising, perhaps hearing that for the first time, if you're not sort of familiar with the world of neuroscience. Look, anti-science is the core topic for this particular episode of The Politics of Everything. I feel like I became really conscious of this concept, if you like, during the recent COVID-19 pandemic. And it might have been similar in the US. In Australia, it became very polarizing. It all became about these new vaccines and people became vaccination. They, it became mandatory in some states of Australia, for example. You couldn't go into like a workplace or a mass event or even traveling overseas, obviously, when the borders opened up without being vaccinated for COVID-19. People felt like it was taking away their sort of liberties, and there was all those kind of debates, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Why does being an anti-vaxxer, if you like, mean being anti-science? Are they kind of linked somehow? Like, it just seemed to me an explosion of this during the past few
Yeah.
years.
Well, first of all, I would say that what we sort of call anti-science is not new. It's been going, I mean, been going on as long as I've been doing my show. I mean, one reason why I started was because I felt like there was a need for accurate science out there. But I've been thinking a lot about this question, and when I think about it, most of the people who have problems with vaccines, they aren't necessarily anti-science. Now, there are people driving, agendas who might be anti-science, But the average person, that's not the problem. In my opinion, the problem is that we've become scientifically illiterate. I mean, there's nobody in mainstream media that understands science. So they'll put up some person who has a harebrained idea and a person who has the science, and they say, here's our fair and balanced coverage, right? And so I think that the biggest problem is that people don't understand how science really works. And in the case of the anti-vaccine situation, I mean, it's really, really, to me, very disturbing because so many people died that didn't need to have died because we turned public health into a political issue. It's, as a physician, I think public health is supposed to be about public health. Vaccines have long been a tool of public health. And, no one was upset about the fact that flu vaccines were, at least in healthcare settings, mandatory. But all of a sudden, this was the thing. But the thing is, it's very upsetting because the COVID vaccine, it should have been the moon launch of our generation. I mean, it was a fantastic feat of science to get that vaccine prepared that quickly. I mean, I remember when the situation first started, I thought, well, it's going to be 2 or 3 years before we have a vaccine. And clearly, we're not really going to get very far till we have a vaccine. But it was a combination of things that made the vaccine available so quickly. One was decades of work that was just sitting on the ready to be tapped. And then you add the money to tap into that research that had been going on. The mRNA vaccines, they didn't just come out of nowhere. There were people who were working on this, and it came along, and they were working on vaccines for other diseases. But when this came along, they realized, hey, this is the time. And so our understanding of immunology has come so far. Vaccines were really, before COVID, very primitive. And all of a sudden, we were able to apply all this new knowledge of genetics and immunology that has been acquired over the last few years, because there hasn't been any money in vaccines.
Right.
And
it's interesting.
I mean, let's face it, the drug companies would rather us get sick and sell us something we have to keep taking.
It. From a business point of view, that makes sense.
But that doesn't change anything about the fact that these are great vaccines and incredible achievement of science. But the problem is people don't understand science. So, for example, they don't understand that, for example, in the States, Tony Fauci said some stuff that turned out to not be right. That's the way science works. At the beginning, we didn't know, so there was mixed messages. But that's the way science works. Science is not dogma. Science is not, okay, we know everything and it's fixed in stone. And, as a physician watching it on the ground, we had as much, if you want to call it anti-science, we had as much of that within the healthcare profession as outside. I mean, I saw
that's an interesting point. Just on that point,
I saw nurses believe things. I saw nurses parrot ridiculous, stories. I'm like, you should know better. And people, they trust a person. So it was a very, I mean, I watched at the hospital I worked at where they kept giving people antibiotics.
Right.
Even though viruses
don't
are
respond
not
to that
by antibiotics.
And even us non-medical people know that. You go to the doctor and they go...
The average person doesn't even understand the difference between a virus and a bacteria, but we certainly should. But so but the the anti-vax thing has been brewing, at least in the States and the UK, for 30 years. And so it's the perfect storm.
Yeah. No, I agree. And just on that point about the nurses, I had a personal experience of, we were between lockdowns in Australia, so this was probably 2 years ago, and I was in a shop, a retail outlet, and I had a woman behind me who was wearing all the masks, and we had to digitally scan in to go into the supermarket and all of that stuff. And she was in a nurse's uniform, and obviously she'd come off a shift, and she was telling me, they're not telling you, they're injecting people with HIV and just wild stuff, which the sensible me could dismiss. But I guess when it's coming from someone who is in that space. And she's like, oh, I wouldn't have got it if I didn't have to go to work, and people are dropping dead and they're not talking about it. And I just don't understand how that became such a common phenomenon globally. Like, we're on opposite sides of the world and it's the same thing.
Right. Right. It's like the conspiracy thinking
Yeah,
just
absolutely.
mushroomed. I mean, it was one thing when they were denying that man ever landed on the moon. That
Oh,
didn't
yes.
really hurt anybody. But this stuff kills people.
Kills people. Yeah, absolutely. And look, I think it's I'd love to look back on this with some hindsight in a few more years and see how the science community, as well as, I guess, the historians, really remember that time, because I do think it was a tipping point, and it created a lot of tension, I think, in people's households even. I had friends who half the family are anti-vaxxers, half aren't. They couldn't get together for Christmas. Like, they were willing to, die on that hill, if you like, metaphorically speaking, rather than do the thing and get the vaccine, which I just found crazy.
But, obviously the optimist of me hopes that if people could understand better, but I also know that people don't change, if they get stuck on something.
Stuck in their ways, yeah.
All the information in the world won't change their mind. So that can be, but, the political leadership that, at least in the United States, that turned it into a political issue when it should have been a public health issue where everybody pulled in the same direction. To me, that's the most disturbing.
Absolutely. And there are many modern examples of conservative anti-science polemics. I'm thinking of things, related to global warming, even environmental issues, the way in which we talk about the energy crisis, which is obviously exacerbated by the war in Ukraine. Why do you think that seemingly these facts about things, like, we know, climate change is real, like the science backs it up. I've just finished a master's in this area, and still I'll get people just saying, oh, but, the planet's always had different climate, and look at the ice age. And, why do you think that these sorts of science-based debates, if you like, even though for me it's kind of a done deal, it's not a debate, why do you think that, groups and organisations mobilise these things to create friction in society? What is it about science that really gets people going?
Well, I don't know that it's science per se, but I mean, the techniques that people are using are really the tobacco industry invented some of this stuff, right? When they, that's 50 years ago, 60 years ago, when they first began to figure out that cigarette smoking was bad.
Oh, yeah.
The tobacco industry started the it's not decided, there's dissent, the facts are not clear, blah blah blah. It's the same stuff that they're, the same tactics that they're using now. And that's why the fair and balanced issue is such a problem, because if the people in control of who gets on the air, so to speak, don't distinguish between the valid points of view and the ones that aren't supported by evidence, the average person doesn't stand a chance. And then if the person has some religious leader telling them that they should not believe it because it's, they should not believe it. I mean, Galileo was condemned by the Inquisition because he said that the earth went around the sun. So,
that's right. I remember
there's
that.
this whole thing about, I don't know
it goes back years and years and years and years.
I don't know
really.
why religions are so threatened by, well, I have some ideas. I think we could go
and this
there.
will be one of my most controversial podcasts. So thanks for playing with me. But look, and for full disclosure, I'm of Jewish background, but I'm also a believer in science. So for me, they're not mutually exclusive. I guess to me, it feels like another political type realm where it's about controlling people and thoughts and, dogma in some ways. I don't know what it is, but even in the Jewish community, ultra-Orthodox, they didn't know about the vaccines because they don't read the newspapers or the internet or secular stuff. And so if the rabbi says don't take it, nobody took it. And because, often large families living together, that didn't end well during the pandemic.
Nope.
So it's a hard one to really understand from our point of view, but it seems like it's a historical fact that over time, religion and science seem to be in some degree of conflict. Explain your view on that. I mean,
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously religion's not a monolith. There are religious people who acknowledge the science of evolution, and there are people of faith like Al Gore who are committed to combating global warming. So you can't just make a blanket statement. But I think it comes down to two entirely different ways of trying to understand the world, and perhaps more importantly, the place of humankind in the world. Because most religions are based on a fixed set of truths, which they see coming from a divine source. And from their viewpoint, if you doubt or you change your mind, it's heresy, even though you don't usually hear the word heresy anymore. In contrast, science is not a fixed set of beliefs or even a fixed set of facts. And this is something that most non-scientists fail to grasp, partly because the way science is taught in school is so bad. I mean, they teach it in school like it's a bunch of dry facts. And so people don't understand that that's not really what science is. So, they hear the story of evolution up against the story of creation, and they just think it's a choice that has nothing to do with evidence. Of course, there's the creation science, but we won't bother with that.
Yeah.
But science, I mean, my sister's gone to Israel at this very moment and she went with a guy who was just talking about how wonderful the Creation Museum in Kentucky was. And I was like, oh my God, I just kept my mouth shut. But anyway, they have a replica of the Ark. Isn't that exciting? But excuse me, I guess I've given away my opinion about that. But science is really, it's a method. It's not a set of facts. It's a method for trying to understand the world with the idea that our understanding is going to be constantly changing and evolving. I just realized, because I was reading this wonderful physics book a few days ago, I didn't know this, but do you know that they actually figured out the Earth was round back in the days of the ancient Greeks?
No, I've never heard that. There you go. I've learned something new.
I didn't know this. I mean, it's like not a new idea.
Right. But it's
okay, but
we didn't believe that for a long time. Well, but flat earthers were a thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they're still a thing.
Right.
It's really a method that has a very simple rule, the experimental method, which is very simple. It's just that you're going to test your ideas and agree that if they fail, like you make a prediction and it doesn't happen, then you move on. I mean, the reason why we believe in relativity is that Einstein made all these, really weird predictions that have turned out to be true.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and like I do neuroscience, it's very fascinating. One of my focuses is on the things we once thought about how the brain worked versus what we now know about how the brain works. Most of it has to do with how we measure. And if you look at the history of science, it's always like that. Like the stuff Galileo figured out, it was because of the telescope. Before the telescope, that wasn't right. The microscope made it possible for us to discover microbes and infectious diseases. Okay. So those instruments allow us to discover new things, but they also sometimes also bias what we can know in any given time, because what we can know is partly according to what we ask. So it's true that that science is done by humans, and so it's not any kind of perfect thing, but it's not the thing that makes it different from religion is the fact that it's supposed to change.
That's true.
Right. And most religions don't want anything to change. By definition, they have the truth.
Yeah. For all time.
Right.
Yeah.
And for all time. And so that's kind of a place that, unless you want, there are people that are people of faith who have figured out how to make that work. But, and when I was a kid, there were people, were very, religious, but they also believed in science. So if you look back at history, I fear that where we are now with all this anti-science is more typical of history as a whole than we would like to believe.
And that's an important point, because I think some of us just think about the here and now and what we've experienced most recently. But if we look back over time, there is a pattern there by the sounds of it.
Yeah.
Interesting. No, that's an interesting debate, which obviously we can't solve in a 30-minute show, but I do appreciate you kind of unpacking your perspective and some observations there. Changing tack a little bit, what would you say is the best life advice or business advice that you've ever been given, and why?
So I call the 90s my new age period, and I had a mentor who said that you should to always show up. And I mean, be where you are, And she also said, if you tell we live into whatever story we tell ourselves. So she said, make your story big, live into a big story. If you have a little story, that's the life you're going to have. It's going to be a little story life. But the number one thing is you got to show up. You can't have a story at all unless you show up.
Yeah. No, I like that. I think that's powerful and applicable no matter what your profession is or where you are in your business life. If we spoke again in a year's time, Ginger, what would be your number one goal to have achieved, and why that goal?
Well, right now, it's just to get my visa and go to New Zealand.
Yep, that's a pretty big thing.
I had my job offer for 7 months, and I've been waiting for the medical council to approve my credentials for 6
So if anyone
months.
out there is listening that can help.
Well, they say that, we have another 10 weeks to decide, and I'm already sold my house and living. I'm actually literally, how they talk about podcasters recording.
Oh yeah, I know that. I've done that before.
I never actually have until now. I'm in my sister's closet.
Right.
But and I kind of hope, I would like to do a new podcast when I go to New Zealand, and I would like to actually, for the first time ever, I would love to have a Kiwi co-host, because I've always done solo shows, and I think it would be. I always tell people who are thinking about podcasting, you really, if you can, get a co-host, because going it alone is hard. Of course, you have to give up some amount of control, but that is my.
It's your hope.
Goal.
Yeah, I like that.
Really,
I think that's a good goal. Final takeaway message for us as we wrap up our conversation today on the politics of anti-science.
Well, I think it's important to realize that it's not a conservative or liberal thing. I mean, we've got people who are anti-science on all ends of the spectrum, which is a little bit ironic if you think about it. The two guys that can't believe on anything agree that they both hate.
Isn't that like the extreme of everything?
Vaccine, isn't that just like crazy? But that gets back to my contention that it has to do with the fact that our population has become scientifically illiterate. But it's difficult because science has become so hard. But scientists are learning that they need to communicate more clearly. But I think we also need journalists to realize that when they do what they call balanced coverage, they just confuse people, and they need to quit giving airtime to the people whose ideas don't have any evidence to support.
That's right.
them. Because I mean, the way that people choose, people rely on consensus. I mean, that's our sort of hardwired way of deciding what's right. Right? You talk to everybody, but if you are listening about something you know nothing about, and all you see is one voice that says this and one voice that says that, and the voice that's all emotional. I mean, because they tell you that the vaccine killed somebody and blah blah blah. Who do you think's going to win out?
Yeah, that's important to remember that.
I mean, I'm the one who took care of the people who died because they weren't vaccinated.
Yeah, you've been at the front line. You've been there.
The guy I had who was vaccinated but got it from his granddaughter who wasn't. See, I look at it as vaccination is not about you. It's a community thing. It's about protecting everybody. It's about protecting the people who can't be vaccinated. It's about protecting the people who don't mount a good immune response. So, there should be a point at which it's not about rights. It's also about our responsibility to one another.
Absolutely.
There is one other thing I would want to share on this topic, is that in episode 208 of Brain Science, I have Xander van der Linden from the Netherlands, who is the author of a book that's very appropriate to our conversation. It's called Foolproof: why misinformation infects our minds and how to build immunity. And he talks about, why it is that these bad ideas, they spread so much more easily, and how and what we can, some things we can do about it.
Yeah. No, I love that. And you are obviously very knee deep into this world. So we do appreciate your time. And if you do want to connect further with Ginger Campbell, of course, there's some details on the show notes. Until next time, take care. And I hope you get to New Zealand, Ginger.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening today. If you've enjoyed the politics of everything, I thrive on your feedback. So please add a short review and share the podcast with your network through Apple, Spotify, and all the usual suspects. I'm always on the hunt for new and diverse guests, so if you or someone you know has a fresh idea you're busting to get out there, please email me at amber@amberdanes.com and my crew will get back to you very soon.